A basketball game to the death. A man beaten to death outside of a bar. 4 men being hunted by a relentless, shape-shifting entity hell-bent on revenge. Stick around to find out more about the book that we're going to be talking about today. Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a horror novel that came out in 2020, and it is a book that I had a lot of fun reading. So today we're going to be talking about some of the themes and my slightly spoiler-filled review of this book. To start off with, the book, The Only Good Indians, is written by Stephen Graham Jones, who is a Blackfeet author. The book itself, majority of it, does take place on a Blackfeet reservation in Browning, Montana, which is where our 4 major characters actually grow up, and it is also where they kind of splinter away from. And with this story, it centers around an event that happens when these 4 men are in their teens and they go on an elk hunt in the winter just before Thanksgiving. And an event happens that's so life-changing and traumatic that it does splinter them away from each other, from their hometown, well, at least 2 of the individuals. And it does alter everything. It comes back to haunt them very literally and fill them with guilt. And that's a theme. One of the themes that I think this book handles very well is the guilt of something that you've done in the past, or maybe the guilt of the sins of the fathers, as well as kind of carrying that expectation, that heavy expectation of what people think about you because of what your family did or what your family is. So to start off with our first character, we actually get introduced within the first few pages to Richard Boss Riggs. He's one of the first character that we meet. He is one of the 4 individuals, and it is not a spoiler to point out that this is the character that actually is beaten to death outside of a bar, because the first line in the book actually tells you that the headline is Native American man beaten to death outside of a bar after a dispute. And he's the first character that we're introduced to. The second character that we're introduced to is Lewis Clark. He is one of the 4 first major characters that we are introduced to, as well as Gabe and Cass. We're going to talk a little bit about each one of these, and at some point in the video, I will actually kind of give a little bit of a pause to go into a little more spoiler detail, because there are other characters that we are introduced to. Right off the bat, I will say that this is a book that was in places kind of heartbreaking to read through, because this entity that is pursuing these men for what occurred is cruel in its methods. It's also very Rube Goldberg-esque in its methods, setting things in motion that can sow distrust and fear and paranoia, and because you start to fall in love with these characters, some of them are not going to make it until the end. So at times, this was a very heartbreaking and kind of wrenching book to read. So with that being said, we'll dive a little bit into each one of these characters. The first character that I mentioned is Ricky Boss Ribs, or Richard Boss Ribs. We actually don't find out too much about his character. He's really there to just kind of introduce things, set things in motion. But he has just decided to move away from the reservation, and he's kind of making his way, finding odd jobs, and he signs on with an oil company, and he ends up being hanging out at a redneck bar. And in the first few pages, he goes outside because he doesn't want to wait for the line to the bathroom. And he sees an elk destroying pickup trucks. And being one of the only two Native American people at this bar, he knows how this scenario is going to play out. He knows that when people come out of the bar, mostly rednecks, they're going to blame him for what happened. And sure enough, that is actually what happens. And so this chase scene kind of begins. It kicks off the story. Unfortunately, he does meet his end in the first few pages of the book. Again, not a spoiler, because the very first sentence is the headline of what actually happens to him. The second character that we're introduced to, Lewis, is a writer who, he's an aspiring writer, but he also is kind of a book and fantasy nerd. He has also moved away from the reservation. He married a white woman 10 years after the event that happened while they were teens. And he is trying to get his life together, trying to build this new life with his wife. And he finds a job at a postal office. And again, very similar to Ricky, he's one of the only two non-white people at his work, at his place of employment. The other character that we are introduced to, besides his wife Peta, is this character Shaney. And Shaney is actually going to be very important to this story. But because of Shaney, she's actually from the Crow tribe. They are kind of perceptually lumped together by their coworkers. They should belong together by default. They should be a couple, even though Lewis is married. And this is where things really start to kick off into paranoia and creepiness. We are following Lewis's perspective through quite a bit of this as he starts to kind of go crazy, and he starts to potentially see things that are not there. He's very guilty for what actually happened in their childhood on that last fateful hunting trip. And this book will really play with you. It'll play with you in the sense that did what I just read actually happened? Is that or is that all in the characters' heads? There's a fun little plot device where the spinning of fan blades creates this kind of kaleidoscopic motion where the truth is revealed by spinning flat fan blades, or at least what the characters think is the truth. This is also repeated when they actually live by some train tracks, and there's a very effective scene where he sees a figure suddenly appear at the other end of the train tracks as trains are passing by, but he's not sure of what he's actually seeing. It's this kind of shutter speed creating this effect, and sure enough, the figure is gone. But this is where it starts to kind of carry into some of the horror film vibes that I was getting from the story. One of the vibes that I got was from the movie It Follows, which has an entity relentlessly tracking these teens as they're going through, and I think the movie does a really great job of kind of playing up the tension, because it's an entity that's after one of the teens, the next victim, and they may be having a conversation, they may be unaware of what's going on. The camera's kind of pulled back to show them all in frame, and then all of a sudden, you as the viewer start to see something in the distance that looks a little off. And maybe it's a background extra that is suddenly making a beeline towards the camera or towards one of the characters. And it is relentless. It's kind of unsettling. It is also very much a vibe that I got reading the Lewis section of this book. And there is something so sudden and so violent and so vicious that happens during this segment. And this is one where I did have to actually stop and reread to make sure that what I was reading had actually taken place and was not just a dream or some type of hallucination, because it is very, very sudden. It is also where we start to kind of get a little bit of the gore and splatter. This book is not end to end walls of blood and splatter and gore, but there are some very extreme moments in there, and very literally splatter soaked, and very descriptive. So in the suddenness and sometimes in the description, it can be a little more grotesque. So beyond Lewis, after we're introduced to Shaney and we're introduced to his wife, Peta, we're also introduced to Gabe and kind of given a little bit of background. Lewis is actually the character that reveals the story of what actually happened on that fateful hunting trip, which we'll talk a little bit more about in the spoiler section. And we're introduced to Gabe. Gabe, a little more, who would be considered kind of the screw up. He just kind of never grew up. He's constantly drunk. By his character, we're also introduced to another very important character, Denora or Denra. There's a joke made that Gabe meant to write Deborah on her birth certificate, but his writing was so bad that he wrote Denra or Denora. Sometimes she's just referred to as D or Den. She was actually about 2 or 3 years old when that fateful event happened in their youth. By now, she's in her teens in high school, and she's a star basketball player. And she's a very important character. We also have Cass or Cassidy, and he is arguably the one who probably has his life the most together out of all of the characters. And he's about to propose to his girlfriend. He's been trying to save up money. He's been working hard. He quit drinking, but he is still friends with Gabe, who I mentioned is kind of the screw up. So these are the characters that are heavily involved in this story. If you don't want to hear about spoilers, if you don't want to find out what this entity is that is following them, I would suggest that you dip out now, because from this point forward, we will be diving into a little bit more of the meat of this story. No pun intended, unfortunately, with that. But with the Only Good Indians, what we find out that this entity is actually a mythological figure in Native American culture. It is a deer woman, and it is the reincarnation of one of the elk that was shot and killed by this group of 4 friends. And it wasn't so much that it was a good hunt. There was definitely a violation that took place. It was definitely more of a massacre that took place. And these characters carry that guilt with them, and it feeds into that paranoia many years later, as they're trying to live their lives, or maybe don't realize how deeply this has affected them. And this is the figure, this is the entity that is stalking these men 10 years later, almost to the day of the anniversary of when this massacre took place. It is a shape-shifting entity, and that adds to, again, this kind of the thing type of vibe for this, where the thing, a lot of people enjoy that movie because it's very gory and over the top, and the practical effects are awesome. But also, I think the reason that movie is so successful is that it creates so much tension and paranoia with this group of isolated men. And I think that's something that's replicated here in this story so well. This entity that's stalking them creates this paranoia amongst them, and it creates these chains of events for many of these characters to meet their demise. And that's where, because those methods are so cruel and there's no remorse, you want to feel empathy for this creature, but sometimes it can be so heartbreaking because the characters that you fall in love with are not going to survive. So she's very cruel, she's very vicious in her methods. I will also say that to point out, Stephen Graham Jones is very much a horror fan, whether that's a book or movies. He did say that he was inspired to write this story partially because of a Joe Lansdale horror short from a series in the 2000s called Masters of Horror, called the Deer Woman. The Deer Woman is traditionally a figure that could be a force for good, could be an ambiguous force for evil, or I should say justice. It is a figure that is traditionally represented as protective of mothers and children. And in the darker stories, we have men that are lured outside of bars or drinking establishments, and then they are later found trampled to death. And the figure that it is in The Only Good Indians is definitely on the darker side of those narratives. The correlation between Stephen Graham Jones also being a horror movie fan is that there's a very key moment when we're introduced to Denora. She is called the finals girl because of her basketball skills, and that is very telling. That is actually the character that we will be following throughout half of the story. So in the first 4 sections, we're introduced to the majority of these four friends or 4 former friends, and after that turning point, we're mostly focused on the survivors. We're mostly focused on Denora. And she is going to be the one who is playing a game literally for her survival, like a game of chess against death, but with extremely physical skills being involved, and instead of just mental will, there's definitely mental wills being showcased there, or mental agility necessary for this. But I love that aspect of Stephen Graham Jones. He kind of throws these little winks and sometimes sledgehammers to tell you that he is a horror movie fan. I mean, myself, I'm a horror movie fan. I just painted a piece based off of a Dario Argento movie. So I love horror films. If you have not read My Heart is a Chainsaw, that is another book that I recommend by him. It's a book about a horror movie nerd. And she doesn't think that she'll ever be the final girl, but at least she can help somebody else survive and be the final girl. And there's a very much anticipated sequel to that book coming out soon. So as I was going through this book, this was definitely something that I very much enjoyed kind of rereading. Normally when I put these videos together, I go through the book and I'm really just kind of skimming through to take down notes, key events, maybe passages that I liked. But with The Only Good Indians, I just enjoyed going back. I almost reread the entire thing from page 1 all the way through the end, because one of the things that this story does very well, it is a very circular story. There are things kind of like Chekhov's gun that are going to come back. They're going to cycle back. Whether it's something that the teenagers did at the beginning of the story, that their daughter or that other characters or that even themselves are going to do later on, it is very much a circular story. And that's also a theme that is mentioned in the book, that everything has a tendency to repeat itself. That also touches on the themes and the guilt of carrying on tradition, carrying on culture, having that weight of expectation. With these characters, they are all born on a reservation. Most of the story does take place on a reservation. I think it's very also significant that the first two characters we meet were characters that decided to move away or move off of the reservation, while the other two characters that we are spending a lot of time on, the other two out of this quartet of friends, chose to remain on the reservation, either through choice or because of circumstance. That's a theme that I connected with as far as struggling against those confines of trying to leave home. I very much grew up in a big town, small city, and all I wanted to do when I was a teenager was just move away as quickly as I could and as far away as I could. So some of these characters kind of reflect that. Another thing that I connected with is that expectation of carrying on culture. Sometimes that could be religion. Sometimes that could be culture that is from your parents' country or your parents' traditions. My parents are Mexican born, and in the small city that I grew up in, it was very much a town that was mostly a white population. But I grew up during the transition to see that shift, that population shift into a more immigrant or Hispanic or other races, other backgrounds, kind of shift that population status. And so that would sometimes lead to racial slurs. Sometimes that would lead to very tough situations that would be very frustrating. I spent most of my teen life not wanting to be seen, for better or worse, as just another Mexican. I wasn't here to steal anyone's job. I wasn't here to be identified just by the color of my skin. And it's taken me a very long time to reconcile with that. It's taken me a very long time to respect who I am as an individual, what my parents did to come to America and try to provide a better life for myself. It's also something where sometimes I would shun that culture. Sometimes I would shun, and I wanted to be as Americanized as possible. And I think that's definitely something that these characters will also struggle with when you find yourself being the only one of only two Native Americans at a bar filled with rednecks, or you find yourself being judged for what your family did, or for the expectation that you aren't making hundreds of thousands a year because maybe you're not working hard enough. And so that was definitely something that I connected with in the story. Definitely something that I'm trying to reconcile for myself as well. Trying to make sure that I keep speaking Spanish, trying to make sure that I'm still trying to instill my background and my culture into my children. So I think that's a theme that is touched on and spent time on in this story, especially with Denora, where her father Gabe is the alcoholic who is constantly pawning or constantly breaking law to not get caught and get away with things, and she doesn't want to fall into that. But the reality is that there's also a carefree spirit. There's a lot of you can't break that spirit, and so in a lot of ways, Denora is very much more alike her father than she would probably ever admit. But it is something that she accepts as the story progresses. So I think if we return back to the theme of the sins of our fathers and the weight of that expectation, that is definitely something that is played on in this story, where you can definitely rebel against the expectations that other people put on you, but you can also use that to your advantage. You can understand that it becomes a part of you. It is part of your identity, for better or worse, and it's your choice oftentimes to make that for better. So with that being said, the The Only Good Indians, at the end of the day, at the end of all this long rambling, is definitely a book that has stuck with me. As I said, normally when I do these videos, I just kind of skim through and I'm just writing down notes, trying to get my outline together. But this one, it was one of those rare books where I had no problem just kind of getting sucked in again. There are things that definitely pay off, little nods here and there, things that will kind of make sense later on. And there are very much winks to the reader. And if you're paying attention, there are things that are figured out extremely early on. It is definitely a book that I would say go in with an open mind. If you enjoy folklore, if you enjoy cultural histories, if you enjoy mythology, if you enjoy movies like The Thing, or if you enjoy Stand By Me, and even though we get that little blurb at the end with the description of what happens to all the characters, sometimes you watch a movie or you read a book and you always wonder what happened after that. Somebody can tell you what happens in text form, but without watching it, sometimes you wished you had that visual. I feel in a way that this was kind of a carry on of that kind of story where something happens in these characters' lives very early on that is very formative. And now we get to see what actually happened 10 years later. So, again, I wholeheartedly recommend The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. If you've read it and you enjoyed it or didn't enjoy it, let me know. If there's anything else I should check out, any other recommendations, feel free to leave them in the comments. And thanks for watching.